אוקיי, אז בוקר טוב, שבוע טוב. We continue our learning about 17th century Ashkenaz. And we learned last week about Rabbi David HaLevi Segal, the author, the mechaber of the Turei Zahav, the Taz on the Shulchan Aruch. But you cannot really speak about Rabbi David HaLevi Segal without immediately speaking about the guy from in the other side of the neighborhood. Right? So if you have the Shulchan Aruch, you have the Turei Zahav on one side of the Shulchan Aruch, and you have from the other side of the street the Shach, the Siftei Cohen. That's the name of the Peirush, the commentary. His name was Rabbi Shabbatai HaKohen. Rabbi Shabbatai HaKohen. I think that nowadays the custom is that people that are being called Shabbatai, they use an Aleph, Shin, Bet, Taf, Aleph, Yud. But if you look here at source Aleph, that is from the introduction to the Shach, he penned a poem. Can you see the poem? So you can see that the last word in every line is Shabtai, or Shavti, Veshavti, Yashavti, Chashavti, Heshavti, Hekshavti. So in all of these lines, it is clear that he wrote his name without an Aleph. So that's his name, Shabtai HaKohen. He was a Kohen, as his name obviously represents. Okay. Now, in many ways, Rabbi Shabtai HaKohen was the complete opposite of Rabbi David HaLevi Segal, about whom we learned last week. Rabbi David HaLevi Segal was, as we said, the perfect example of an Ashkenazi Rav. So he grew up and he was raised in the right family by the right teachers, and he waited patiently to his turn. And when he was old enough, he published his Peirush, and he was almost, we may say, the chief rabbi of Poland, of Polin, of back then. So that's a very classic commentary and a very classic, we may say, persona. Rabbi Shabbatai HaKohen was very, very different. Now, he also was born to the rabbinic elite. So it's not a Cinderella story. It's not someone that is coming from nowhere. His father was a Rav. His grandfather was a Rav. He was acknowledged as an Ilui, a prodigy child, from a very young age. He was married to again, in a very young age, he was married to the granddaughter of the Rema, Rabbi Moshe Isserlish. From here, you can already see that he was seen as a great individual, and also that he had a good ichus, because you do not marry to the Rema family if you are coming from nowhere. And also, he also came from a very well-to-do family. As I said, in Poland, many times, not always, but many times, money married Torah. That's the heyday, the good days of Poland Jewry. That's the way it worked. If you were a good guy, if you landed in the right yeshivot, and you had the right recommendations from the Rashi yeshivot, you had a very good chance that the local gvir, the local rich Jew, would be interested to marry his daughter to you, and also financing you for your first years of life, and then giving you his business. I mean, that was a very good package deal. And the Wolf family that Rabbi Shabbatai HaKohen married into was no different. So they were, as I said, grandchilds of the Rema, and they themselves were also, Baruch Hashem, very well-to-do, a Krakow, the Rema, a Krakow family. So the Shach, after married, again in his teens, he is moving to Krakow. He was born, I didn't say, he was born in a place I never heard about, and maybe some of you are more experts in Polish geography, Amestivova. Surely I also completely butchered the pronunciation. So even if someone knows the city, no way that you would know it now. He was born in 1621. So he's about 40 years younger than Rabbi David HaLevi Segal. That is a fact that is going to play a large role in our story today. As I said, So he's living his first 15 years, let's say 20 years in as a child to a rabbinic family, to a well-to-do family. He's being taught mainly by his father. He quotes his father many times in his commentaries later. He also, in one of the books that I hope that we'll be able to speak about later, that he published, he attached 10 responses, 10 tshuvot from his father. So he saw himself as a talmid of his father, and the father also wrote a poem that was printed as part of the introduction to the Shach, to his son commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, which is, I think, a nice thing to do, writing a poem for your son. Okay, so up to the age of 20, that is not something very unique. So we speak about a very talented young man that everyone is looking at and saying, okay, he's going to be something. But he is not yet anything. He's a great guy. He's learning at the kollel, we may say today, but nothing more than that. And then at the age of 24, each one of us would now think for a second what he was doing at the age of 24. Now let's see what the Shach was doing at the age of 24. At the age of 24, the Shach publishes, not beginning to write, he is publishing a commentary on the whole part of Shulchan Aruch called the Yoredea. Now, what is the Yoredea basically? The Yoredea is the miscellaneous, I'm shonot. Miscellaneous, thank you. That's the miscellaneous part of the Shulchan Aruch. So when it's not Rabbi Yosef Karo, it's Rabbi Yaakov, the son of the Rosh, when he wrote the Arba Turim, so he had a very clear plan. In the section named Orach Chaim, he put all the ritual halachot that has to do with the daily cycle or the yearly cycle. So the tefillot, the brachot, the chagim, all of this was put into what we call Orach Chaim. There was another section named Choshen Mishpat, into which all the monetary laws were put. So that's, again, very easy. There was another section named Even HaEzer, into which all of the laws that relate to the relationship between the sexes were put. So that is Even HaEzer. Now, what do you do, for example, with the laws that are about Kibud Horim? Where would you put them? And where do you put the laws about Shchita? Now, I think that it's easy to see that there is no internal connection between the halachot of Shchita and the halachot of Kibud Horim, maybe in some families, but in most families there is no internal connection between these laws. Nonetheless, there is a fourth section of the Shulchan Aruch named Yoredea, and that includes Ilchot Shchita, Kibud Horim, Ilchot Talmud Torah, Ilchot Tzedakah, Ilchot Avelut, the whole of Kashrut, the whole of Nida. So you see, from here, that is not something that is necessarily has an internal cohesion. Yeah, that's a word. Yeah, but it's as I say, it's a repository of everything that didn't fit into the first three parts. Fine, that's the Yoredea. So that is also, we may say, one, I don't know if the most difficult part of the Shulchan Aruch, you know, everything is the most difficult when you engaged in it. But it is a very difficult part of Shulchan Aruch. Ilchot Shchita are very difficult and complicated. Ilchot Nida are very difficult and complicated, and so on. So it's not an easy feat to write a commentary on the whole of Yoredea. It requires you to be an expert in all fields of Torah. If you write a commentary on Choshen Mishpat, then you need to be an expert in, let's say, a third of the Torah. It's very good. It's very good. But being able to write a commentary on Yoredea is to be a man of all trades in Torah. It's to be very comprehensive. And that is what the Shach is doing at the age of 24. But now, it's not only that he was able to write on everything in Yoredea. It may be that I also would be able just to write something on every part of Yoredea. The question is not only to what extent do you write, but obviously, what is the quality of what you write. And here the Shach achieved something that was just, meaning people see to this day, and it is very hard to believe that one person without a computer would be able to do what he did. It seems that he read every book, Torah, meaning halacha book, that was in Krakow. That's just the beginning. And everything was cataloged. Everything was in order. So when he relates to a topic, to any topic, he surveyed from the early sources to the most recent ones to his day, obviously. And it's very difficult to find a source that he would not relate to. So that's very thorough and extensive work. It is to such a level that if you look at source bet in the page, that is from a book called Shem HaGedolim. Shem HaGedolim is a history, a short biographies of Torah scholars that was written by the Chida. The Chida, Rabbi Yosef Chaim David Azulai. I hope that we'll speak about him when we reach the 18th century, so there is some time before we would speak about him. But he was a very important Sephardic rabbi. And he was very known, the Chida I'm saying, was very known as not only as a Torah scholar, which he was a giant, but also as an historian, bibliograph. So he was engaged in studying books, not only the content of the Sefarim, the books themselves, when they were published, in what editions. So he had this mind for history. And he wrote a very, again, comprehensive biographies, short biographies of Torah scholars, which he named Shem HaGdolim, name for the greats. And in the entry about the Shach, about Rabbi Shabbatai HaKohen, so he writes the basic biography details, and then he writes, V'shamati merav echad. So he says, I heard from a certain rabbi, Sheharav Shach, that Rabbi Shabbatai HaKohen, our hero, Haya Yodea Shem HaMetzia. He had the name to find. Now, what does it mean? The name to find. So he explains, Dehaino, that is, Shem Kadosh, he had a Kabbalistic knowledge of a holy name, one of the holy names of God, Lechaven bo velimtso habkiut sherotze techef umiyad. So he had a mystical ability to, he would utter a name, God's name or an angel name, and the angel would find for him the material he needed. Yeah, he had a Google, exactly. He had a mystical Google, exactly. Now, why would such a story emerge? Why would such a story emerge? Maybe it is just correct, but we have no, we read his introduction, he says nothing about the Malach. He speaks about his effort that he put into the Sefer. The reason why someone would come up with such a story is because it's just unbelievable how otherwise you would be able to write such a commentary. It's very simple. Meaning, I guess that this Rav that the Chida is quoting here was learning the Shach and saying to himself, you know, okay, I'm not as smart as the Shach, so I wouldn't be able to write the commentary. But how does he know so much? How did he have time to learn all of that? Put aside the wisdom, put aside the analytical skill, just the time. So it must be that he had some type of a help from upstairs to be able to achieve such a thing. Now, what is interesting is that in later editions of Shem HaGdolim, so the printers added that it seems that the Shach didn't have only this name, holy name, to find the material he needs, but also that he had some holy name that would write instead of him. So, because that is for other reasons, we would see the Shach niftar very young. He died at the age of 41, as we would speak about, Yirtzeh Hashem. And he was able to achieve in short 41 years more than many other people were able to achieve in few lifetimes. So it must be that he was just sitting there and, a few pens were writing for him. Yes.
But in a serious, do we know if these Mepharshim were so broad and had assistants?
We know that in recent generations, they had meaning we have a whole teams sitting. Now, a project like Art School is not the project of one single person, but is a team, a work of a team. I hope that in a few minutes would read his own introduction, and he would write, he was not using a team, he was using readers. So he had like critical readers to read and to note and to sometimes return to him if they are not happy with the outcome. And he says, I didn't publish anything before a few people went through it. So that's the aid that he had, but we do not speak here about, assistant researchers and things of the like. It was not invented yet.
Yeah, also lahavdil, when you meet people with a photographic memory, like I've met a few over the years, it's incredible to see how they can just work through information. Like to the average person, it is
like a magic, yeah. Yeah, I completely agree.
I was just telling you about the recent Bible quiz and how these kids were sitting there and they asked them something and it's like in their head, they're going through just every source. And some people have this gift from God.
Yeah, for sure. But even between them, there are levels.
Yeah.
And, when someone is just able to master all the halachic works at the age of 24, that's something that is very, very, very unique. Very, very unique. Let's read his introduction. Because we have to understand something. When he is publishing something at the age of 24, it's not only that people are going to say, wow, you are such a great man and such a scholar. If you are writing an halachic work, that's not a work about lomdish, about pilpul, about iyun, something that people can enjoy just learning. He is giving here a psak. Now, who are you to give a psak at the age of 24? So he needs also to explain himself, almost to apologize, as we will see. So let's begin to sit inside. I would read very quickly the short poem that he attached in the beginning, and then we'd read his own introduction. Let's see. הקדמת המחבר בקצרה. אחת דיבר בשפה ברורה. So he says, this is my short introduction. I'm going to speak it very clearly. שאלתי מאת השם אותה אבקש שבתי. So that's Shabbatai, right? So he says, I asked from God, that's what I'm requesting, my sitting, dwelling, בבית השם לאורך ימים חגי חודשי. So I want to sit in the house of God for many days and for many months. ושבתי, תענוגות בני אדם בסוד משחקים, לא ישבתי. So he said, I never enjoyed the pleasures of human beings. So that's, we already beginning to see. He's trying to explain to you how in the age of 24, he is publishing such a book. He says, I never indulged. When you were playing outside, I was sitting and learning. יגידו עליי רעי, כי דרכי חישבתי. So my friends, if you'd ask my friends, they would give testimony. They would say that I always looked and calculated my time. הדעות הצודקות בררתי והזרות אחור השבתי. So I always was looking for what is right, and what was wrong, I completely rejected. כי אם לבינה קראתי, I called wisdom my mother. It means, so I was always attached to wisdom. ולחוכמה אוזני הקשבתי, and I was always listening to knowledge. השולחן אשר לפני השם ערכתי בקומי ושבתי. So he says the table that is in front of God, what he means here is obviously the Shulchan Aruch. He says, I am going to set it. נדרשתי לאשר ביקשוני ולאשר שאלוני השבתי. He said, the reason why I'm publishing that is because that I was asked. So again, it's not something that I just stand up and write. People were asking me. What I am doing here is needed. חזק גואלנו השם צבקות יאמר שבתי לירושלים ורחמים רבים אמן כי יהי רצון. And if you look at the beginning of every line, not at the end of every line, you can see Shabtai, 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 Shabtai. But also in the beginning, the acrostichon. What is English? Acrostichon. So just look at the first letter. Shabtai HaKohen Chazak. Okay. So you can see here you can see, I mean, he's a genius in many levels. Yes. Okay. So now let's read the introduction itself. Amar HaMechaber. So the author is saying, Et asher yasim Elokim befi oto adaber. I am going to say only what God would put in my mouth. That's already a very high aspiring introduction. There will be many quotes here from the Tanakh. As always, I won't be able to point every and each one of them. בלשון קצר וקל, so I'm writing in an easy and short language. למען יהי לנבון נקל, so the wise man can read easily. ובאתי להודיע לכל אשר ספרי זה אליו יגיע. So I want to notify everyone that would acquire this book, or that this book would reach him. כי לא חיברתי חיבור הלז להגיס ליבי בהוראה. Please know that I didn't write this commentary in order להגיס ליבו, to be, wow, I don't know how to translate that, to be like presumptuous about paskening. So if that is your first line, you can understand the opposition that he meets, right? Rabbi David HaLevi Segal, when he wrote his book at the age of 70 or 65, didn't need to write in his introduction, I am not taking a place that does not belong to me, because his place was already safe. He was the chief rabbi, more or less, of all of Poland. So it was expected of him to write an authoritative commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. But who is this young guy coming at the age of 24? So he has to write, I am not writing that in order to be considered, to be respected. ולומר קבלו דעתי. I'm not saying that you must accept my opinion. Again, compare it to the Rabbi David HaLevi Segal we learned about last week. What he wrote was that the reason why I write this book is because the Torah is becoming too many Torot. I want, again, to reconcile all the Jews, or at least all the Ashkenazic, or at least all the Polish Jews, into one halacha. So obviously, why do I write my commentary? Because I want everyone to adopt my bottom line. Maybe he wouldn't write it this way. He was very modest, Rabbi David HaLevi Segal, but he saw himself as uniting all again, at least the Polish Jews, under one halachic system. But here the Shach says, no, I'm not saying that you should accept my opinion. שהן רשעים ולא אני. כי צעיר אנוכי לימים, I'm very young. על כן זחלתי וירא, I am fearful. כי ערום אנוכי בדעת, בזוי עם, תולעת ולא איש. So that these are phrases of humility. Right? So I'm a worm, I'm nothing, I'm useless. אף כי באמת ובתמים, truth to be told, he says, באמת ובתמים, טרחתי טרחות הרבה. So that's me. I am no one and nobody. But you should know that I worked very difficult to produce the sefer you hold in your hands. כמה יגיעות יגעתי ולא עסקתי בשום עסק אחר. So I worked, I toiled. I was not engaged in anything else. לא נתתי שינה לעיניי. I was not sleeping. תנומה לאפפיי. שנים רבות. Now he's 24. How many is שנים רבות? 4 years. I don't think that he began to write at the age of 13. עד אשר הוצאתי מכוח אל הפועל מחשבתי, ובררתי ושקלתי הכל בכף מאזניים. So until I worked, I toiled, I didn't sleep, until I was able to write this commentary and to execute what I was planning. And everything here he says, I carefully checked. שקלתי בכף המאזניים. וחזרתי על כל צדדים וצדדי צדדים. And I searched every corner. No stone was left unturned. לא פעם אחת ושתיים, and not only once or twice. כי 100 פעמים ואחד, 100 times and one. I checked every entering my commentary. Im chaverim chashuvim, that's the theme. So I have important friends here. Ahuvim, chavivim, ve'arevim, amakshivim lekoli. So people that I have here friends that I was teaching them, and while teaching, that's something that many Rabbanim did. While teaching, they were also writing. So in that way, you could check yourself while writing, because you would give the shiur. If someone would have a question, you would know that you need to somehow change maybe the formulation, sometimes maybe the conclusion. מי שלא היה איתי עמי במחיצתי, לא יאמין כי יסופר לו מגודל התלאה שהייתה לה. It says, people that were not here would not believe the toil, the work I put into this work. So it's so interesting. So he began by this humility, by saying, I am nobody, I am no one, but he knows his value. שהייתה לי בחיפוש בים התלמוד והפוסקים, עד כי העמדתי הכל על בוריו. Okay, so he continues, as always, מה שהלב חושק, הזמן עושק. So what the heart wants, I want to read the whole thing, but our time is limited, and I do want to speak a little more about other things, about the Shach. What is important here to understand is that this commentary, and it was extremely impressive, extremely impressive. Everyone that reads the Shach's commentary, you cannot read it without being blown away. No less than that. The thorough treatment he gives to every and each subject, from the beginning to the end, and then he gives you his conclusion, is wow, is extraordinary. Is really is outside of, even in the world of Torah, in which we are used to geniuses writing their commentaries, that is really something that is very unique, very unique. Now, one thing he didn't have, or maybe the angel responsible for the pen didn't have, and that is, he wasn't very, at least in my humble opinion, but not only in my opinion, it was not extremely clear. So the writing is not so easy to follow. You really need to put yourself into work. It's beneficial, it's worth the effort, but he's not writing in extremely clear way. That's just what it is. So the commentary of the Shach is for Torah scholars. It's very difficult for a layman who is not really into the sugya to understand what he's doing, just as the nature of the commentary. But that is the only flaw I can speak of regarding his commentary on the Yoreh De'ah. There was only one problem, but it was not a problem in the Perush. It was the problem that he published it in exactly the same year in which Rabbi David HaLevi Segal published his own commentary on Yoreh De'ah. So you have here the old, respected, authoritative rabbi of Poland in the age of 65, writing and publishing his commentary on Yoreh De'ah. And then you have this 25 young guy from the Koilel in Krakow publishing his own commentary on the same Shulchan Aruch section, on the same Yoreh De'ah. Now, if it was clear to everyone looking at these commentaries that the Taz is much, much more clear and more extensive and more authoritative, then that was not such of a storm. There were many commentaries that were published through the years that just never gained any traction and were lost. The problem was that everyone that looked at it was not so sure that he needs to discard the Shach and hold the Taz. Maybe it's the other way around. So that's a very delicate situation. Even if you're extremely modest and humble, and I think we saw last week that Rabbi David HaLevi Segal was extremely humble and modest. But there is also the question of just the order of things. The order of things is that you wait to your turn. If you are 25, you can write to your My Documents, keep it there, go over it through the years, teach it to your students, that's fine, sharp it, fine-tune it, and the ripe age of 70, then publish your work. And no one would say anything. But publishing it in the age of 25, that is something completely different. Now, it's not only that in some places it was more machmir or more makel from the Taz. My impression, which may be completely wrong, I didn't do any systematic check, I think that it was somewhat more machmir than the Taz. That is my impression, but it may be completely wrong. It may be completely wrong. However, the big machloket was not only if you are big makel somewhere or makel somewhere. There was a big difference in their approach to learning, which played itself again and again. It's not a difference that they made up, but it surfaced very, very strongly. And that is that the Taz was mainly going by authority. So if you remember, he had his father-in-law, Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, the Bach, was a great authority, and he had his Rabbanim, and he was more or less playing by the book. The Shach came up, and he said, no, we are going back to the sources. We are going back to the Gemara and to the Rishonim and to the Achronim, and I am going to check everything and to weigh everything on my scales, just as he wrote, and I would give you the right conclusion regardless of what the earlier authorities thought about it. Now, obviously, I'm taking it to an extreme. The Taz also has independent opinions, and the Shach also sometimes just say we need to accept the older generation's opinions. But basically, that is the difference between them, what it boils down to. The Shach would have no regards to sometimes disagree with the Shulchan Aruch himself, with the Rema, him being married to the Rema's granddaughter, notwithstanding, he would still disagree with the Rema, he would disagree with the Shulchan Aruch, he would disagree with everyone. He would not disagree with the Rishonim, but from time to time, he would even say that the svara of a certain Rishon, the thought of a certain Rishon cannot be accepted. Let's say. Not incorrect, but cannot be accepted. So that's a very fresh approach, may we say, and coming from a very young man, you can see why that would cause an uproar. And it did. We have some letters that were written to the Shach, some letters that were written from the Shach, in which he was attacked about certain positions that he held in basically what his opponents wanted. No one wanted to humiliate him, or to shut him down. What they wanted was to say to him, you see, you have still mistakes of a beginner, so please hold your commentary, refine it, go through it again and again. And as I said, publish in 30 years, what are you rushing for? And so what they wanted was to point to him apparent mistakes that if he would not be in such a rush to publish, then they would not appear. And in his letters, again and again, he does not only defend his positions, but he also says to them, you should know that I worked very hard, as we saw in the introduction, I worked very hard. You would not find apparent mistakes because there are none. I took all of them out. I'm not saying that I am always correct. As I said, part of his approach is that everyone should have his own critical thinking. So just as he is analyzing everything from bottom up, so he says everyone should. I do not say you should accept my opinion. I am not going like the authoritative way of others. But you wouldn't find clear mistakes, and obviously it's very difficult. I mean, I am obviously not in the level, but also others not. So there are no clear mistakes in the Shach, and then he goes a step further, because the Taz right at the beginning does not respond. Okay, fine, both of them published works. Let the market decide who would be chosen. But then the Shach does another thing. He writes comments on the Peirush of the Taz. So again, now imagine a 25 years old guy writing comments on the authoritative commentary, on the authoritative chibur of the chief rabbi. Just imagine the event. Now, he doesn't publish it immediately. It would say to his mayor, I don't know if he's mayor, but he maybe understood it to be too much. But he gives it over in his shiurim. And not only his shiurim in the yeshiva in Krakow, he also goes around and gives shiurim all over Poland, teaching his asagot on the Taz. Now, the asagot are reaching the Taz, the Rabbi David HaLevi Segal, and he writes his responses, which he attaches to his Taz, and he calls it Daf Acharon, a final page, which is attached. But in this final page, he doesn't write the name of Rabbi Shabbatai HaKohen. It just says, some people said, and I respond. Some people commented, and I respond. Now, how do you approach that? There are two ways, right? So omitting someone's name when you disagree with him. One way, it's a sign of respect. If I disagree with you, I do not mention your name because I don't want to say he is wrong. So it's better for me to say there are people who are wrong. The other way to approach it is to say you ignore him because you do not even count him as someone who is worthy. Thank you, worthy of mentioning. And that is a known tactic. Ignore someone in hope that you disappear. If I, Rabbi David HaLevi Segal, would mention him, I would uplift him into the A-League. But if I ignore him, then he would just be, okay, so there is someone shouting out there. We cannot know why the Taz did omit the name of Rabbi Shabbatai HaKohen. Obviously, he's referring to him. That is not a question. But he does not mention his name. Now, you would see how the Shach accepted it. In his introduction to the Hasagot, so before the Taz responded, when the Shach was only writing his own Hasagot, so in the introduction to that it says, Al ya'ale alev hakoreh besifri zeh. So someone who reads my book should not think שמפני שהיה לי חס וחלילה מחלוקת עם הבעל טורי זהב, או שהיה לי בליבי איזה טינה עליו, חיברתי השגות על ספרו. Do not think that I had some dispute with him, or that I'm angry about him, and that's why I wrote my comments on the Taz. כי הלא נודע לכל, נתקיים בנו את והב בסופה, so everyone knows that in the end, he's using here a midrash, which I cannot go into, but he says, everyone knows that in the end, we are good friends. And as a proof, I became a host for the Turei Zahav, because when the Turei Zahav was running away in 1648, 1649, you remember we spoke about Zero Tach Vetat, and Lemberg was destroyed, then I hosted him in my house for 2 or 3 days, and we spoke in the Torah. So you see, everything between us is fine. That's what he was writing in his introduction to the first comments. But then the Taz wrote his own answers on the Shach without mentioning his name. And then the Shach wrote answers to the answers about the answer. Okay, you understand? Okay, so it's a dialogue. And that's called Turei Zahav. Let's see the introduction to the Turei Zahav in source Dalet. But Daf Acharon, who, he doesn't mention here a name, who, הולך וסובב דברים עליי. So he's encircling me with words. רק ירא להזכיר את שמי, but he's afraid for mentioning my name. אך מובן לכל מבין, but everyone with an inch of a mind understands, שכל שכתב בדף האחרון וכל מה שטרח, לא טרח אלא בשבילי. But I know, and everyone that understands knows, everything that he is toiling about, everything that he is making an effort is for me. ובאמת צהדי במרומים, שמאחר שקריתי ושניתי ושילשתי היטב בכל מה שכתב בדף הזה, נהניתי מאוד ונתתי שמחה בלבי. And he says, and I put God as my witness, that after reading carefully 1, 2, 3 times what he wrote, what the Taz wrote as a response, I became very happy. You know why I became very happy? כי בלי ספק מי שיש לו חך לטעום, יראה ויבין שכל דבריו הם דברי הוואי. So I became very happy because if this is what he has to answer, he has nothing, because all his words are divrei avai, empty words.
Isn't he a bit egotistical?
Look, when Torah is boiling, then sometimes water are flowing. I would say that. I would say that. Yeah, I think that he was really insulted by the Taz not mentioning his name. And truth is, that can be understood. I try to give a more kind interpretation to why the Taz didn't mention the name of the Shach. But to be honest, I can understand. I mean, if you would completely ignore, that's one thing, which also insulting, but okay. But answering without mentioning my name, okay, I can understand. And he says, "Lo ba'ala lekanter ulekapcheni ba'alachot." So everything, all these answers are only in order to answer, but they are not a strive for the truth. ומעתה צריך בדיקה אחריו, וזה גרם לו שבדקתי אחריו עד מקום שידי מגעת. So he says, so now that we know that what he writes is in order to answer and not in order to get to the truth, then we need to get to the truth. So that's why I need again to go into the sugiyot, and again he writes. So as you can see, there is an exchange, sharp exchange of words between them. And the Shach remains basically in Krakow, and he's heading a yeshiva, and he's writing this, he wrote this Yoredea, and he's writing his Asagot. At the age of 29, he becomes a Dayan in Vilna. Now, Vilna nowadays is part of Lithuania, but back then it's part of Poland. I think I spoke about that a few times, that Poland back then was a very big kingdom, which had Poland itself. It had Lithuania, it had part of Belarus and Ukraine. So 4 lands. That is what we call Vad Arba Aratzot. So the committee of the 4 lands. I mean, it's not exactly as I said, because the political entities are always shifting in these places, not as stable as here in the Middle East where everything is. So anyway, he's going to Vilna, but Vilna is part of Poland. And he's going to Vilna, and he's becoming a Dayan there. And as a Dayan, he writes 2 books, mid-short books, about specific questions that he was asked as a Dayan. Both of them are classics and are used to this day. One is called Siftei Cohen. What is Siftei Cohen? Siftei Cohen is a case in which, I don't know, 10 minutes, okay. So Siftei Cohen is a book about what happens if one of the parties in a financial dispute, in a monetary dispute, takes hold by force the property that is in debate. Because our rule is that when we have doubt, then the money remains where it is. That is our general basis rule. If you want to take money from someone, you need to bring proof. If you cannot bring proof, the money would stay put. But what happens if the money already exchanged hands, but not by legal means, but by force? Does that exchange is still, do we acknowledge it? Now, obviously, as you can understand, this question can have many, many, many details. In what stage? Before the beginning of the legislation, right? Before the beginning of the Beit Din, right? Before suing or after suing? What was the amount of force that was used? We speak about someone coming with a gun and taking. We speak about someone taking something from the street. So there are many, many details that can go inside. So he wrote a whole tractate dedicated to answering these questions. What is very interesting is, as a part again of having complete and vast knowledge in everything that was written on the sugya, everything, and again, writing in a way that, at least for me, is not easy to read. But a part of these traits, there is something very interesting. Rabbi Shabbatai HaKohen, in a way, in a manner that would seem surprising to us as living in modern state, is very accepting of using of physical force as a way, as a vehicle to change the monetary status. That seems very strange. And there are several explanations that were advanced to explain, again, not only how he explained it in the Sugyot, believe me that he can prove it in the Sugyot, but other Rabbanim were able to prove other things. So the question, why did he choose such a unique, we may say, route? And here, a very scholarly woman in the name of Michalti Koczynski, maybe you heard about her. She is heading the Morasha, I think, Bet Midrash in Yerushalayim. So she wrote a whole article on the Shach, on the Siftei Cohen, and she claims that because Poland, as we would explain in a minute, was in a very strong political turmoil during the Shach years. We spoke about Gzerot Tach Vetat. So the state was very weak, and as an outcome, the courts didn't really were able to enforce their decisions. So much more was relying on people taking care of themselves than of the courts being able to enforce their decisions. That's very speculative. He never writes such a thing. I thought it's interesting enough to bring it here. Another explanation may has to do again with his own opinion. He was not completely trusting of the authority. He thought that everyone should chart his own path. So again, to an extent, if you know that you are right, you are allowed to take what belongs to you. That's everything must have limits, but to an extent, that's basically what he says. So he says it both in his writings, and he says it as a writer. Okay, another book that he wrote was named Gvurot Anashim. Gvurot Anashim was about a question of what happens if a man in a marriage is impotent. And obviously they do not have the medical situation to help him back then. So can the woman demand a get? So it seems that in Vilna, the minhag was to enable the woman to, in such a case, to require her husband a get, and they would enforce him to give a get, and he was against it. So he wrote a book opposing this minhag. Again, it's an extensive treatment of the sugya, and we here do not have the ability to go into it. But it may be part of his, I said earlier, I think that he has some tendency towards chumrah. I think it's part of that. I mean, we should know that in halacha, enforcing a get is something that we are very careful about, because if we are forcing it by mistake, then the get is not valid. The woman is still married, although she received the get, and then when she would marry the new husband, the children would be mamzerim. So poskim that are very careful, we may say, or very strict, are very careful about giving this type of allowances, of permissions in enforcing a get. It may be what is in play here behind the scenes, but maybe we do not need all of that. He analyzed the matter, and that's just the conclusion that he reached. So being in Vilna in 1648, 1649 was a very good bet. Why? Because the Ukrainians revolting against the Poles never breached not into real Poland and not into Lithuania. So they only remained in Ukraine. So the Shach was unharmed in 1648, 1649. He did wrote a short essay about the history of what he saw, what witnesses were telling him, and it's called Megillat Eifa. I quoted here in source Hay, and time is so short. Very shortly, I would say that. Let's just read it, a few lines, because it's so beautiful. He's writing beautifully. כי עוד חמת יד המיציק, הצר הצורר נטויה בחרבות וכידונים, ותמיד הם פושטים בארץ ולמלחמה הם מוכנים ומזומנים, ובכל מקום אשר ימצאו מהיהודים, הורגים ובולעים כתנינים. So he says the enemy, means here the Khmelnytsky and his armies, so they are everywhere, and they have their spears, and they are attacking the Jews, and they kill them and they swallow them as reptiles. התאספו יחד רב מהריקים, הריקים is the Ukrainians, that's the way they call them, the rikim, the empty ones, the Cossacks. מזוינים ולבושי שריונים, so they are armed, they wear their שריון, armor, thank you. ומאספים אליהם רב מהקדרים אשר סביבותיהם חונים. Now it's not only the Cossacks, it's also the Tatars. So they are enjoining people from Russia coming in to help the Cossacks. And that's part of the history of Ukraine and Russia, which we do not have. No, I am also not the expert to speak about. We obviously don't have the time to go. ויאמרו לכו ונכחיד ישראל ושמם נמחה כעננים ולא נשאיר להם שאר וזיכרון עם הראשונים והאחרונים. And he goes on, he wrote a few keynotes, and he was one of the authorities that made Kaf Sivan, which not kept today, I think, anywhere, but Kaf Sivan was a fast day for the atrocities of Zerotach Vetat of 1648, 1649. So he was able to stay in Krakow, but then in 1649, another thing happens, because Poland is just beginning its 20 bad years, which would call in the Polish history the deluge, or in the Hebrew chronicles it would call the Mabul. And what happened then was that now that would seem to you as a repeating story, but it happened to Poland again and again. The neighbors saw that Poland was extremely weak because of the internal revolt of the Ukrainians. So the neighbors said, if they are weak, now it's the time to take part, to partition Poland. And as I said, that would happen at least to my knowledge 3 times in the history of Poland. Maybe it happened more. So who are the candidates to take parts from Poland? One, obviously, is the Russian, which would always be happy. It's just the history. Meaning, what happens now, we tend to see everything just in our own lens. But when you look at history, it's just a repetition of something that happened again and again. Russia invading into Ukraine, or into, regardless of how it would be called. It's just something that happens every 100 years. So they invaded. That's what from one side. And then from the West, now it's a surprise because history repeats itself, but every time with a tweak. And the twist is that the enemy invading from the West is not the Germany or the Austro-Hungary or what usually happened, but the Swedes. Now, that sounds strange because, right, yeah, there is a real country, there are real people, yeah, there are. And back then, in the 17th century, they were, surprisingly, maybe for us, but they were one of the strongest army in Europe. That's just what it was. So the Swedes invade Poland. And yeah, that's what happened. It's called the Great First Northern War. That's in Wikipedia, that's how they call it. And they invaded. And basically, at a certain point, the Polish understood that they are toasted because they are being invaded from both sides and they were not very strong to begin with. So then they understood, and again, that's a repetition of history. It's better for them to fall to the West than fall to the East. That is the history of Middle Europe in one sentence, right? The question is, you are going to be taken anyway. It's just a question of what would you prefer. And usually you prefer the West. So they began to surrender to the Swedes in order to uphold the advance of the Russian. It didn't help Vilna. Vilna fell to the Russians. And they slaughtered everybody in the best tradition. And obviously they also slaughtered the Jews. The Shach himself was able to flee away with most of the Jewish community. They understood what is going on. When the Russians were approaching, they heard the noise of the fight. They understood what is befalling them, and they all ran away. Not all. Some remained behind because you cannot take everyone, and the ones that remained behind, unfortunately, did not survive. So he began to run away, and he, in the end, again, I'm making everything very short, but he ends up in a place called Helishoi, which again, obviously, I'm certainly slaughtering, but it's in nowadays Czechia, Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic. Back then, it was a part of the Austrian Empire. It's Bohemia, Moravia. It was part of the Austrian Empire. And there he becomes again a Dayan. It's a small city. I mean, it's obviously it is not to his level. It's not to his level. He's very known. It's not to his level, but he has time to write another part of his commentary on Choshen Mishpat, which is again a masterpiece. This time there is not even a contender. It's not like that we had a Taz in the last time. This time it's an immediate bestseller, we may say, and it more or less is the most authoritative work to this day. So it survived as the authoritative work for 400 years, so 350 years. On Choshen Mishpat is also has some very interesting connection with a local magister, but not a religious magister, but an Hebraist, a Christian scholar that is interested in Hebrew and in the Hebrew history. And we have a letter that the Shach wrote in Hebrew to this guy. His name is Valentini Vidrich. So that's very interesting. We would have wanted to have more information about that, but we only have this letter, in which he says, you asked me for a certain sefer about diktuk, about grammar, Hebrew grammar, and this is the sefer. He gave him the sefer, and I would like to see your work. That's what the Shach says to this Christian professor. So, but that's what we have. So it's very interesting, but we don't know anything beyond that. He was niftar in 1662 in the age of 41. That's it. So in the age in which they advised him to begin to write his sefarim, he passed away. So Baruch Hashem that he didn't heed to these advices. And it seems that he knew in a way that his time spent here is very short. And he accomplished, as I said, what many other people would not accomplish in several life cycles. Now, the competition between him and the Taz, we may say, continued. Both of them were already in the Olam HaEmet. I'm sure that they are sitting upstairs and learning together in Chavruta. But here on earth, the competition continued. And the grandchildren of the Taz were able to influence the Vad Arba Aratzot, this board of Jewish committee, that they would issue an order that on your Edea you must pasken as the Taz and not as the Shach. But you understand that this type of orders from above, we do not have a Sanhedrin, it cannot work. Every rabbi in the end is doing whatever he wants. And nowadays, we may say that in the Yekish tradition, the Taz is upheld as the higher authority. But in the more Lithuanian tradition, the Shach is the Shach rules. So obviously, again, there are exceptions, etc., etc., etc. But the Shach is considered not the final word, because as we would see, Be'ezrat Hashem, Torah would continue, but as a very authoritative person. If you rely on the Shach, you have a very safe ground to stand upon. As we conclude, I think that the Shach, in many ways, a part of all the, I think, the fascinating history and the fascinating character that obviously he had, also did something very, very important. He revived, or I wouldn't say that he is created, but he revived the movement back to the sources. Because after the publication of the Shulchan Aruch, everyone was just engaged with commenting on the Shulchan Aruch and explaining what the Bet Yosef meant and what the Rema meant. And suddenly someone stands up and is writing on the Shulchan Aruch. But he says, I want to go back to analyze from the beginning. And that is something that, as we will see, Be'ezrat Hashem, would play a larger and larger role in Ashkenazic Torah scholarship. So we are ending here. I hope next week to take a quick detour to the Hispanic world, to the Sephardic world, because we have neglected them for too long. So we take a short jump to there, and maybe I'm still working on that. I hope that we'll be able to speak about some Torah scholar and also be able to survey the whole of the Shabtai Tzvi affair through the Sephardic lenses. So that's Be'ezrat Hashem for next week. Thank you very much.